Hello everyone, thank you for joining me. This is the fifth lecture on my short course on livelihood research. This lecture is about livelihood research on power relations and social exclusion. My name is Leo de Haan and I'm from the Netherlands. Give me a minute to share my screen. I am Emeritus Professor of Development Studies. Before my retirement, I was Rector of the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague in the Netherlands. The ISS is the oldest and leading development studies institute in the world. Before my appointment at ISS, I directed the African Studies Center in Leiden, the largest center of its kind in Europe. I was trained as a human geographer, and throughout my academic career, I have focused my research on livelihoods in Africa. This course is on the MA level and is open to all interested students, anywhere in the world. The purpose of the course is to make you familiar with livelihood research and to inspire you to use it. In previous lectures, I explained the basics of livelihood research, introduced you to an advanced interpretation, and questioned the sustainable livelihood framework. This short course has also a second objective, call it a reflective objective. The reflective objective is about contextualizing livelihood research against the backdrop of a critical assessment of development studies itself. Any topical interpretation and practice of livelihood research can only be achieved through this second objective. This lecture is about power relations and how to examine it. And after that, I will explain why livelihood research focuses more and more on social exclusion. In the previous lecture, I discussed the sustainable livelihood framework and the neoliberal context in which it emerged. It is often argued that because of its neoliberal context, livelihood studies in those days, say around 2010, neglected or ignored power relations. But that is not entirely correct. Livelihood research did often include power relations in its analysis, but usually power as defined by the so-called residual perspective, and rarely as defined by the so-called relational perspective. Both perspectives address power, but with completely different ideological assumptions. The residual perspective considers poverty as a result of being left out of the development process. According to this perspective, interventions are needed to make development more inclusive for the poor. The residual perspective in livelihood research tries to understand why the poor cannot make better use of various livelihood opportunities. Development interventions should improve that. These supportive interventions may come from many directions, from the state, from development agencies, non-governmental organizations, and increasingly in those days from the private sector. And they all aim for connecting the poor better to markets. The residual perspective interprets power as power too. Power too is a productive power able to create new possibilities, creative power that expresses agency. It's therefore an interpretation of power that goes well with neoliberalism. By contrast, the relational perspective argues that poverty is not the result of a lack of market integration, but the result of the exploitative character of market integration and social relations in general. The relational perspective regards power too as extremely limited. Instead, it puts emphasis on power over, an exploitative power built on force and domination. Because of exploitation, people are poor. This also explains that the relational perspective, instead of focusing on development interventions, aims for social mobilization of the poor in order to overthrow exploitative social relations and their underlying structure. Which lessons should livelihood research learn from this? As discussed in Lecture 4, livelihood research rose in a particular ideological context in which markets were set to reign. People would become more independent, also to cope for themselves instead of relying on the state, and thus use their agency, downplaying the strength of the exploitative power over that blocks agency to work. Looking back at my personal trajectory in livelihood research, I gradually moved in the course of time from Giddens and the transformative potential agency, the power to, towards Bourdieu and the strength of power over to maintain exploitative structures. Over the years, I've simply seen too many instances where societal structures blocked people to improve their livelihoods and blocked poverty alleviation policies to become effective. There is still room for agency and power too, in my view, but in many instances structure and power over have the upper hand. This transition in thinking can be seen everywhere in modern livelihood research. While poverty was at the core of livelihood research at the start of the millennium, the emphasis moved to exploitative social relations and their underlying structure, resulting in social exclusion as the root cause of poverty. So I will move now to the second part of the lecture. When at family parties like this, I have to explain what a professor in development studies does. My standard reply is that I do poverty studies and that I want to understand poverty and that I want to make poverty history. That usually yields approval and admiration. Everyone agrees poverty is bad. But of course, it's too easy an answer. Poverty and inequality are outcomes of the transformation process we call development. And development studies, and thus livelihood research, should not only focus on outcomes, but rather on an analysis of causal processes. So development studies, including livelihood research, has to dig deeper. Mind you, I'm not arguing that poverty is not important. Though world poverty has declined considerably in the past decades, 659 million people still live below the poverty line of $2.15 per day in 2023, which is roughly 8.5% of the world population. Both in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, absolute numbers are still rising. Today, Sub-Saharan Africa is the world's poorest macro region. But as I said, poverty is an outcome of the transformation process we call development. And development studies and thus livelihood research should not only focus on outcomes, but rather on causalities. The bottom line in development studies is to understand the causal processes which are underlying to the accumulation of power and wealth on the one hand, and marginalization and poverty on the other hand. In doing that, our ultimate goal is to identify the prospects for emancipation and social justice. To achieve that, understanding poverty power dynamics means both in the meaning of power over and power to is key. Therefore, not poverty as such, but social exclusion has become the core of modern livelihood research. Social exclusion means that individuals or groups are being excluded from full participation in society. Understanding social exclusion means looking at multiple overlapping disadvantages by focusing on institutional rules, relationships and processes through which access to livelihood resources and opportunities are assigned. The full scope of social exclusion becomes apparent when it is linked to the concept of intersectionality. The actual practice of social exclusion depends on the background of an individual in terms of class, age, gender, race, culture, disability, and other specific characteristics resulting in intersecting social divisions. Intersectionality entails that processes of exclusion are layered, overlapping, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes not, but never reducible to each other. The understanding of social exclusion in livelihood research can be modeled as a layered analysis of exclusionary practices encountered by the poor when organizing their livelihoods. The first layer of access to resources and opportunities. The second underlying layer of power relations and power struggles. And the third, even deeper layer of impeding structures. This three-layered examination can best be illustrated by imagining that poor people give shape to their livelihoods as it were in a journey, an historical trajectory through an enormous labyrinth of rooms, corridors, stairways, floors and chambers and other spaces, together representing the house of society. I repeat, by imagining that poor people give shape to their livelihoods as it were in a journey, an historical trajectory, through an enormous labyrinth of rooms, corridors, stairways, floors and chambers, and other spaces, together representing the house of society. In the first layer of analysis, all spaces represent livelihood opportunities and have doors and windows and hatches and trapdoors beyond which lie other spaces, representing other livelihood opportunities. Sometimes these other spaces are very different from the previous ones. Sometimes they are quite similar. For example, one door opens to a field in which you can cultivate and grow your maison. Another door leads to a river where you can fish. A staircase may join a furniture-making shop. Another window has a view over construction materials to build your shelter with. But you can only open these doors and windows or climb that staircase if you have the right key, that is, the right assets and access qualifications. So at first sight, it might not seem too difficult to grow maize on that field, but you need the necessary skills, seeds and a hoe, and you need to have access to the plot, either by title or kinship. To fish the river, you need nets, but access is often regulated through communal property rights. Most likely, you can enter that carpenter shop, you can rent that carpenter shop, though often you need to bring your own tools. Usually this also applies to building a home. Finally, a ladder may give way to a school for your children. But every new school year, you need money to pay school fees and school uniforms. All these constitute the first layer of livelihood analysis, the layer of access to resources and assets and of entitlements, all indispensable to exploit livelihood opportunities in order to make oneself a living. Sometimes a living at the level of bare survival, sometimes at a more bearable or even sustainable level. The second layer is that of power relations and power struggles. For example, one window provides a view over a street where vendors sell food to informal sector workers strolling around in search of a cheap lunch. On the surface, that looks like an easy, accessible livelihood opportunity. You know how to cook food, you can prepare it on your stove at home and then sell it on the street. But this fails to consider the power relation behind the scene. Every spot on the pavement is already occupied by a vendor who considers that spot hers. They may let you have a spot in an alley around the corner, but only if you are related to one of the vendors. Moreover, all vendors have to be on the alert for overzealous policemen. They threaten to confiscate your wares if you do not bribe them because you cannot produce a trading license. There are similar power struggles if you want to open other doors. Official regulations often impede the informal livelihoods of the poor, including their informal housing. These can only be dodged by bribing officials or by connecting to a patron for protection. Sharecroppers are similarly at the mercy of landowners to cultivate land. Sometimes schools refuse to allow marginalized people to register and enroll as children, or charge an unlawful fee with the same effect. Thus, all rooms with livelihood opportunities on the first level of analysis also contain power struggle for survival and livelihood improvements. These power struggles, not directly visible but ever present, constitute the second level of livelihood research. The third level beneath is the deepest layer of impeding structure. In the labyrinth of rooms, corridors, stairways and other spaces, many poor people do not even consider opening particular doors and windows to particular livelihood opportunities because they really believe that these opportunities are not meant for people like them. Some hatches and doors may not even be recognized as such because the frame of reference of past experience is lacking. For example, bonded laborers accept their debt and its distressing installments as inescapable, and sharecroppers see no other way than to continue accepting the unfair bid of the landowner. Many poor people are not only unable to afford school fees, but also think that schools are not meant for people like them. They live an obedient, servile life because that is what they consider as proper. That is an unconscious pattern of behavior. Faithful Anglican women in North Uganda will not brew beer as an income because their church opposes it. In the labyrinth of rooms, corridors and stairways and other spaces, they know that there is a door. They even know where to find the key to open it, that is, they know how to brew beer, but they will never open the door and access that livelihood opportunity. Similarly, in Cotonou, Benin, rich urban businessmen only want young Fulani men from the north of the country as herders for their cattle because they consider these agropastoralists as the best herders. From their side, young Fulani men seem to perceive only one livelihood opportunity, herding cattle. Habitus, as Bourdieu calls it, leads them to a livelihood of herding cattle even in the city. Here we touch upon the invisible but persistent underlying structures directing social behavior. That is the third and deepest layer of livelihood analysis. By examining people's livelihoods along these three superimposed layers of analysis, livelihood research has been able to reveal, disclose and disentangle power over, the exploitative power built on force and domination that operates in the second layer and which is embedded in the impeding structures of the third layer. However, with the understanding of people's livelihood trajectory through this three-layered model, the possibility of livelihoods enhancing practices and interventions aiming to counteract exclusion, the power too, also becomes conceivable. For example, after they became members of a microcredit group, some Anglican women in North Uganda started brewing and selling beer, and now earn an income from it. In addition, numerous civil rights advocates help marginalized people to register their children at schools, while others support sharecroppers to press for implementation of land reform. In this way, livelihood research has an important role to play in making social policies and social protection schemes effective. By way of summary, in the past, livelihood research focused on concrete practical issues like low income and consumption, hazards, illness and death, vulnerability and insecurity, and for good reasons. But by putting social exclusion rather than poverty at the core, livelihood research has arrived where it belongs, at the analysis of encompassing issues of domination, power and social structures which disclose the roots of poverty and impede social inclusion and emancipation. As a consequence, the basic model of livelihood research of my first lecture and the sustainable livelihood framework of my fourth lecture are good starting points for your livelihood research, but by no means sufficient. They can only serve as the groundwork for an analysis of exclusionary practices encountered by people when organizing their livelihoods. For that analysis, the three-layered model which I just presented, the first layer of access to resources and opportunities, the second layer of underlying power relations and power struggles, and the third layer of impeding structures, will deliver the necessary superstructure for your research. In the next lecture, that is lecture 6, I will explain how social protection policies try to counter social exclusion. Meanwhile, you have the opportunity to complete some coursework and to join my online class on livelihood research and social exclusion. This short course on livelihood research uses the so-called flipped classroom model. This usually means that students go through lower levels of cognitive learning during their preparation before class starts. This enables students to engage in higher levels of learning in class with fellow students and the lecturer. You, YouTube viewers, can also take this short course through a flipped classroom. In practice, it means that for each lecture, your coursework consists of 5 successive parts. The video lecture of around 20 minutes to watch and to watch whenever it suits you. Second, if you are interested, there is also mandatory literature to read. The mandatory literature clarifies issues already discussed in the lecture. To a large extent, you encounter again the issues of the lecture, but the mandatory literature also examines some issues more in depth. Third, if you like, I can also provide optional literature. The optional literature presents additional explanation on relevant issues and offers practical, contemporary and inspiring examples on how to organize research on a particular issue. Of course, you are advised to read the optional literature attentively, but if you have little time, you should at least glance through it. Then I can send you an assignment. The assignment enables you to apply the subject material discussed in the lecture and the mandatory literature. And finally, after having completed these 4 steps, I offer you the opportunity to participate in online classes, either individually or in a small group. Date and time of online classes will depend on your wishes and what your schedule allows. During that online class, 1 class per lecture, you will have the opportunity to raise questions for clarifications, then to formulate critique, and then to engage in applying the subject material by discussing the assignment. It's best to complete steps 1 to 4 before moving on to the next lecture, and it's mandatory for participation in the online class. The reason for that is simple. By completing these 4 steps first, you will have achieved already the lower levels of cognitive learning, meaning that the online class will become much more fruitful and challenging because you as students and me as your lecturer, will be able to engage in higher levels of learning and evaluate, such as applying, analyzing, and evaluation. So, start each lecture by watching the video. On your request per mail, I will make available various resources, that is, a document explaining the didactical approach, the mandatory and optional literature, and the assignment. And don't worry, all docs are open access, and date and time of the online class will depend on your wishes and what your schedule allows. So thank you for now. Thank you for your attention. I hope to meet you again in the next lecture, and of course in one of my online classes. Next lecture is about social protection policies and how they try to counter social exclusion. Hope to see you again. Bye-bye.